It was late summer, 1944. The war in Europe had reached a critical point. In the West, Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were pushing inland after the success of D-Day. The Germans, battered and overstretched, tried to hold their lines. The fighting was brutal, and every mile gained came at a heavy cost. The Allied High Command needed a breakthrough, a way to crack the German defenses once and for all. The place was Normandy, northern France. The hedgerows and villages had turned into natural fortresses. German soldiers dug deep into defensive positions, using every field and hill to their advantage. They had machine gun nests, mortars, and anti-tank guns hidden under camouflage. The Allies had to move slowly, clearing one position at a time. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. As August approached, the Allied plan shifted. Operation Cobra was designed to break out of the Normandy region and open the road to Paris and beyond. The key to this plan was overwhelming firepower. The Allies would bring together hundreds of artillery pieces, along with airstrikes and naval guns firing from off the coast. The goal was simple: destroy German defenses with such intensity that resistance would collapse. The numbers behind this effort were staggering. The Allies had thousands of tons of ammunition stockpiled. Supply ships crossed the English Channel every day, bringing more shells and fuel. Truck convoys, known as the Red Ball Express, moved supplies to the front around the clock. In contrast, Germany faced a shortage of everything. Allied bombing raids had destroyed railways and factories. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition production was falling. German factories could only produce a fraction of what the Allies were ready to fire in a single day. On the morning of the attack, the sky over Normandy was clear. At dawn, the first artillery shells began to fall. It started as a rumble in the distance and quickly grew into a roar. Hundreds of guns fired at once, pounding German positions. The ground shook. Clouds of dirt and smoke rose into the air. The barrage continued hour after hour. Soldiers on both sides described the sound as deafening, like a continuous roll of thunder. The sheer volume of fire was unlike anything the Germans had seen before. In just one day, Allied forces fired more shells than Germany could produce in an entire month. Trenches collapsed. Command posts were destroyed. Communications lines were cut. German units were isolated and unable to coordinate. Those who survived were left stunned, unable to fight back effectively. For the Allies, the barrage was carefully planned. Every target was mapped in advance. Forward observers directed fire onto key positions, adjusting aim as the battle progressed. Some guns used a technique called a rolling barrage, where the fire moved forward in time steps, just ahead of the advancing infantry. This allowed Allied troops to follow closely behind the curtain of explosions, protected from enemy fire. German soldiers caught in the bombardment described the experience as terrifying. They huddled in their dugouts, hoping to survive. Many had no chance to return fire. Some units simply broke and ran when the shelling stopped, leaving their positions abandoned. Others tried to fight but were overwhelmed by the advancing Allied forces. The destruction was so complete that some German officers compared it to natural disaster rather than warfare. As the shelling lifted, Allied tanks and infantry pushed forward. The path was littered with craters, shattered equipment, and burned-out vehicles. In some areas, entire German units had ceased to exist. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. The breakthrough finally came, and the Allies poured through the gap. Roads that had been held for weeks suddenly lay open. Behind the scenes, the disparity in resources became clear. While the Allies could afford to fire tens of thousands of shells in a single day, the Germans could not replace what they had lost. Each shell fired by the Allies represented a level of industrial might that Germany could no longer match. Allied factories in the United States and Britain worked around the clock, producing more guns, tanks, and ammunition than Germany could ever hope to equal. The shock among the German ranks went beyond the battlefield. Reports reached the High Command that Allied forces were firing more ammunition in one day than German industry could supply in a month. This realization spread a sense of despair. The war was no longer just about tactics or skill. It was now a contest of production, and Germany was losing. In the following days, the effects of the artillery were visible everywhere. Roads were filled with German prisoners marching to the rear. Civilians watched as Allied columns moved forward, past villages reduced to rubble. The psychological impact was enormous. For Allied troops, the sight of their own firepower gave them confidence. They saw firsthand what their side's resources could achieve. For German troops, it was a clear signal that the balance of the war had shifted beyond recovery. The industrial might of the Allies had been building for years. American factories turned out trucks, tanks, planes, and ammunition on a massive scale. British and Canadian forces added to the total. By the summer of 1944, this power reached its peak. The barrage in Normandy was a visible demonstration of that strength. It was not just a battle tactic but a statement. The Allies could sustain this level of fire for as long as it took to win. That day in Normandy marked more than just a battlefield victory. It showed the true scale of Allied logistics and planning. Every shell fired had to be shipped, stored, and delivered to the right gun at the right moment. The coordination required was immense. Thousands of soldiers worked behind the front lines to make it possible. They drove trucks, loaded shells, repaired equipment, and kept the supply lines open. Without them, the guns would have fallen silent. As the campaign continued, the German army faced a grim reality. Their soldiers fought bravely, but no amount of courage could overcome the imbalance in firepower. The single day of shelling became a symbol of this larger truth. It was a moment when the outcome of the war became visible, not through speeches or plans, but through the relentless sound of artillery hammering the earth. The Allied In a single 24-hour period, the Allies fired tens of thousands of shells. This level of fire required an enormous supply of ammunition, carefully stored and moved into position. Each gun needed a constant flow of shells to keep firing. Soldiers worked non-stop to bring crates of ammunition from rear depots to the gun crews at the front. Trucks lined the roads, delivering their loads under cover of darkness or during brief lulls in combat. The movement was continuous, with no room for delay or error. The coordination behind this firepower was just as impressive as the numbers. Allied planners mapped every target in detail. They used aerial photographs, ground reports, and intelligence to identify German strongpoints, supply dumps, and routes of retreat. Fire missions were laid out in advance, down to the minute. When the operation began, each battery knew its targets and the exact timing of its role in the larger plan. The result was a carefully controlled storm of fire that moved across the battlefield in a predictable and deadly pattern. This level of planning required reliable communication. Field telephones, radios, and signal lines connected forward observers with the guns behind them. Observers near the front adjusted the fire as needed, calling for shifts or corrections when targets moved or new threats appeared. The system allowed Allied artillery to react quickly, giving infantry the support they needed as the battle changed from hour to hour. On the German side, the picture was very different. By mid-1944, German industry was under relentless attack. Allied bombers struck arms factories, railway junctions, and fuel depots almost daily. Production plants that had once supplied the front with steady streams of weapons and ammunition were now damaged or destroyed. Even when shells were produced, getting them to the front was another challenge. Fuel shortages were crippling. German trucks and trains struggled to move supplies. Many vehicles were abandoned because there was no fuel to run them. Guns sat idle in some areas because there was no way to bring in ammunition. Moving heavy artillery required fuel, spare parts, and intact roads. With the transportation network under constant attack, German units often received only a fraction of what they needed to fight effectively. The imbalance in production was stark. In 1 month, German factories could turn out a certain number of shells, but the Allies could fire that same number in a single day. This was not just a difference in quantity but a reflection of two very different war economies. The Allies had mobilized their industries fully. American factories operated around the clock, producing weapons and supplies on a scale that no other nation could match. Britain and Canada added their own production to the total. Every shell fired in Normandy had a chain of workers, ships, and trucks behind it, all part of a vast system designed to keep the guns firing. One key part of this system was the Liberty ship, a type of cargo vessel built in huge numbers by the United States. These ships carried ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and food across the Atlantic. Once they reached ports in England or France, their cargo was unloaded and sent forward by rail or truck. The speed at which these supplies moved was critical. Any delay could disrupt the entire operation. On land, the Red Ball Express became the lifeline of the Allied advance. This was a network of truck convoys that ran day and night, hauling supplies from the ports to the front lines. Drivers followed strict routes and schedules, keeping the flow constant. They often worked under difficult conditions, facing long hours, poor roads, and occasional enemy attacks. Without their efforts, the artillery would have gone silent. Technology also played a role in making the artillery more effective. Radar spotting allowed the Allies to track enemy movements and locate artillery positions. Aerial reconnaissance provided up-to-date images of the battlefield. Pilots flew over enemy lines, photographing trenches, bunkers, and supply points. These photographs were studied and used to plan precise strikes. The combination of radar and reconnaissance meant that Allied gunners rarely fired blindly. Their shells landed where they would do the most damage. The logistics of moving and managing so much material were as complex as the fighting itself. Every shell had to be accounted for, from the factory floor to the gun barrel. Storage areas were carefully organized to prevent confusion. Supply officers worked with transportation units to make sure that the right ammunition reached the right batteries at the right time. Even small mistakes could have serious consequences. A delay in delivery might leave a gun without shells at a critical moment. For the German army, facing this kind of firepower was demoralizing. Their own guns fell silent for lack of ammunition, while Allied batteries never seemed to stop firing. German commanders knew they could not match the volume of Allied fire. They tried to conserve their shells, using them only when absolutely necessary. This meant that many German infantry units fought with little or no artillery support. The contrast between the two sides grew sharper as the campaign went on. Each day of battle widened the gap. The Allies could replace lost guns and vehicles almost immediately, while German losses were often permanent. The difference was visible on the ground. Allied forces moved forward behind a wall of fire, while German units struggled to hold even a fraction of their positions. The success of the Allied artillery in Normandy was not just a matter of more guns and more shells. It was the result of a carefully built system, one that stretched from factories in the United States to the fields of France. Every part of that system had to function smoothly for the plan to work. When it did, the result was overwhelming firepower that no enemy could withstand. Artillery effort in the summer of 1944 was a demonstration of sheer industrial strength and precise planning. It began with numbers that seemed almost impossible. The Allies positioned hundreds of field artillery pieces along the front. These included standard 105mm and 155mm howitzers, heavy guns capable of firing shells miles into enemy lines. Along the coast, battleships and cruisers used their naval guns to add even more weight to the barrage. The range and power of these weapons meant that no part of the German defenses was safe. The German soldiers waited in their trenches, tense and weary. The fields and hedgerows of Normandy were quiet except for the distant hum of trucks and the occasional burst of gunfire. The men expected an attack. They had heard rumors that the Allies were preparing something big, but no one knew the scale. Their officers told them to hold their positions at all costs. Orders came down to be ready for infantry assaults and tank thrusts, but most believed it would be another localized push, like the ones they had faced for weeks. The defenses were strong, with machine guns carefully placed to cover the approaches and minefields hidden in the tall grass. Behind the lines, Allied commanders studied maps and timed their watches. The plan for the artillery was set to the minute. The rolling barrage would move forward in a steady pattern, with infantry advancing close behind it. If the timing worked, the Germans would have no chance to regroup. The artillery officers gave their final instructions to the gun crews. Shells were stacked beside the guns, ready to be loaded. Radios and field telephones connected every unit to the command posts. The entire operation depended on precision. In the early hours of the morning, the last preparations were made. Allied infantry lay in their assembly areas, waiting for the signal to move. Tank crews sat inside their vehicles, engines off, ready to advance once the barrage began. In the distance, heavy bombers circled, preparing to hit German strongpoints ahead of the ground assault. The air was damp and still, holding the smell of fuel and gun oil. At the first light of dawn, the sky erupted. Hundreds of guns fired at once. The sound was immediate and overwhelming. The ground shook under the force of the explosions. Within minutes, smoke and dust covered the horizon. German soldiers crouched low in their trenches as the first shells landed. Dirt and debris rained down on them. Entire sections of their defenses vanished in the blasts. The barrage did not stop. It rolled forward in waves, each one timed to crush another line of defenses. German communication lines were destroyed almost instantly. Field telephones went dead. Runners sent with messages never returned. Officers tried to raise neighboring units but heard only static. The front was cut off, each pocket of resistance left to fight alone. Allied troops followed close behind the wall of fire. As the shells moved forward, infantry moved up to occupy the shattered positions. Tanks rumbled over the craters, firing at anything that moved. Machine gunners fired short bursts into the smoke, clearing paths for the advancing riflemen. The plan was working exactly as intended. For the Germans, there was no clear defense. Some units tried to hold their positions, only to be buried when the next wave of shells struck. Others fled, hoping to find safety farther back, but the barrage was relentless. It reached every dugout, every foxhole, every crossroads. Soldiers who had fought bravely for weeks now faced a force they could not see or strike back against. German commanders received fragmentary reports as the attack unfolded. One message described an entire company wiped out in minutes. Another reported tanks destroyed before they could even move. The scale of the destruction was hard to grasp. Command posts were overrun by the speed of the Allied advance. In many places, there were no reserves to send forward, no fresh units to plug the gaps. The smoke grew so thick that daylight seemed to fade. Flames rose from villages set alight by shellfire. Roads were cratered and impassable. German vehicles were abandoned where they had broken down or run out of fuel. Tanks sat silent, their crews dead or gone. Horses, still used to haul some artillery pieces, bolted or were killed in the blasts. The carefully prepared defenses that had taken weeks to build were now rubble. Among the German troops, confusion turned to panic. Without orders or communications, some groups surrendered as soon as Allied troops reached them. Others fired wildly before retreating through the fields, leaving their weapons behind. The discipline that had held the line began to collapse. For many, survival became the only goal. Allied infantry moved through the wreckage with methodical precision. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles under the cover of tank guns. Medics treated the wounded as the advance continued. Prisoners were gathered in groups and marched to the rear. The attack did not pause. Each step forward was supported by fresh waves of artillery fire. The rolling barrage kept moving, forcing the Germans back mile after mile. The scale of the devastation became clear as the day went on. Craters stretched across the countryside in every direction. Villages were reduced to ruins. Fields that had been green and quiet days before were now blackened and scarred. Allied commanders received reports confirming what they had hoped for. The German line was breaking. As night fell, the guns slowed their fire. The smoke began to clear, revealing the full extent of the destruction. Entire German units had disappeared, either destroyed or scattered. The survivors retreated in disorganized groups, leaving behind equipment, wounded men, and even officers who had lost control of their commands. The roads were clogged with wreckage. Vehicles burned where they had been hit. In the rear, German staff officers tried to piece together what had happened. Maps showed positions that no longer existed. Messages from the front contradicted each other or arrived too late to matter. Some officers reported that their divisions were gone, either annihilated or in full retreat. The scale of the collapse was unlike anything they had faced before. For the men who had endured the barrage, The memory of that day was burned into their minds. They spoke later of the noise, the smoke, and the feeling of helplessness. No tactic or training had prepared them for such overwhelming firepower. The realization set in that the front could no longer be held. The Allies had achieved what they set out to do. They had broken through the German defenses, not by a single bold maneuver, but through relentless, crushing force. The artillery had paved the way, and the infantry and tanks had followed through. The battlefield was theirs, and the enemy was in full retreat. The Allied soldiers crouched in their assembly areas, waiting for the barrage to lift. At first, they could only hear the distant thunder of the guns. Then the ground under their boots began to tremble. The sky ahead glowed with orange flashes. Men shouted to one another over the noise, but often went unheard. Some had fought since the landings in June, yet none of them had seen or heard anything like this. As the rolling barrage moved forward, they advanced behind it. The curtain of fire seemed alive, a wall of explosions moving steadily ahead of them. Soldiers looked at one another in silence, wide-eyed, as they realized the scale of the firepower supporting them. Confidence grew with each step. They knew the enemy in front of them was being torn apart before they even arrived. For many, it felt like the balance of the war had shifted in that moment. Tanks followed closely, engines rumbling as they climbed over churned-up earth. Tank commanders peered through periscopes, watching for any sign of resistance. Infantrymen moved between the vehicles, rifles ready but rarely fired. In some places, there was no need to fight. The German positions were already silent, their occupants killed or fled. Allied soldiers moved past wrecked bunkers and collapsed trenches without stopping, amazed by the destruction. As they pushed deeper, they began to see the enemy. Groups of German soldiers stumbled out of the smoke with their hands raised. Some were dazed, ears ringing from the barrage. Others were bloodied, their uniforms torn and burned. Allied troops herded them to the rear without incident. There was no fight left in these men. Many prisoners spoke of being trapped under the bombardment for hours, unable to move or even speak over the noise. Some described comrades buried alive when dugouts collapsed, others blown apart by direct hits. Among the Allied soldiers, the effect was electric. Seeing the enemy surrender so quickly reinforced their belief in the operation. They spoke in low voices about how this was different from the battles of June and July, when every hedgerow had been contested bitterly. Now they were moving freely, supported by a machine of war far greater than anything they had known before. The power of their artillery gave them a sense of certainty, a feeling that the advance would continue until victory was reached. For the Germans, the experience was entirely different. In the hours before the barrage, many had tried to prepare themselves. They cleaned their weapons, checked their positions, and waited for orders. When the shelling began, preparation became meaningless. The noise was deafening. Men pressed their hands to their ears and screamed without hearing their own voices. Earth collapsed around them. Shrapnel tore through sandbags and walls. Dugouts that had seemed secure crumbled in seconds. Some German soldiers stayed frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Others ran blindly through the smoke, only to be caught by the next wave of shells. Entire squads vanished without leaving a trace. When the barrage finally lifted, those who survived were stunned and disoriented. Few had any sense of where they were or what was happening. Officers tried to rally them, but many soldiers ignored commands and fled. Panic spread quickly. Men shouted conflicting orders. Some fired their weapons wildly before throwing them down and running. There were moments of desperation and chaos. In one village, a German unit attempted to form a defensive line, but was overrun almost immediately when Allied tanks rolled in behind the bombardment. In another sector, a group of soldiers surrendered as soon as they saw Allied infantry appear through the haze. They had no ammunition left and no hope of relief. The psychological toll was immense. German veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front compared the barrage to the heaviest Soviet attacks, but with one critical difference. The Allies did not stop after a single day. The weight of fire was constant and organized, with fresh shells always ready. The realization sank in that there was no escape from this machine. Even hardened troops felt their resolve crumble. Civilians caught between the armies endured their own nightmare. The shelling did not distinguish between soldiers and villages. Homes collapsed under the bombardment. Fires spread unchecked. Families huddled in cellars, praying for the explosions to stop. When they emerged, the world they knew was gone. Roads were filled with rubble and corpses. Wells were contaminated. Livestock lay dead in the fields. Some civilians fled the area entirely, walking for miles with what little they could carry. Others stayed, trapped by the fighting. They watched as German soldiers retreated past them, some wounded, others in full flight. Allied troops followed soon after, giving food and water when they could. Despite the relief of liberation, the cost was plain to see. Entire towns had been erased from the map in a matter of hours. Survivors told stories later of how they endured those days. One woman recalled hiding beneath the stairs of her home while shells tore through the upper floors. A farmer described digging through debris to find his family alive beneath the ruins of their barn. These accounts revealed the human cost of the battle beyond the military objectives. For the Allied soldiers, seeing civilians emerge from the wreckage was sobering. They gave them rations and blankets, but they could not undo the damage. The war moved forward, and the people left behind had to rebuild from nothing. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the scenes they had witnessed, though many found the words inadequate. As the days passed, the contrast between the two armies became even clearer. Allied troops marched forward with steady supplies and overwhelming support. They rotated units to keep men rested and ready. German survivors, meanwhile, stumbled backward with no clear direction. Their formations were shattered, their officers killed or missing. The battle left a mark on everyone involved. For the Allies, it was proof of their growing power and coordination. For the Germans, it was a moment of despair, a clear sign that their position was collapsing. For the civilians, it was a tragedy that would take years to recover from. The sights, sounds, and losses of that day would not be forgotten by any who lived through it. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield told the story. The German defensive lines were no longer lines at all. What had been a network of trenches, bunkers, and fortified villages was now a stretch of broken ground littered with wreckage. Craters marked where guns and machine gun nests had been. Roads were blocked by burned-out vehicles and dead horses. The men who had held those positions were gone, killed, captured, or in flight. The Allies moved quickly to exploit the breakthrough. Infantry advanced past the shattered German positions, followed by tanks and motorized units. Engineers cleared debris from the roads so supply trucks could push forward. In some areas, there was no organized resistance at all. The speed of the advance shocked even Allied commanders who had prepared for a slower, harder fight. Where German troops had once fought fiercely for every hedgerow, they now fell back in disarray. The effect rippled across the front. When one sector collapsed, neighboring units were forced to retreat to avoid being cut off. The German defense unraveled like fabric pulled apart at the seams. Entire battalions disappeared as they were surrounded or captured. By nightfall, the map looked different. The Allies now held ground that had been in German hands for weeks, and their patrols were pushing deeper by the hour. The immediate battlefield result was a complete rupture of German control in the region. It opened a path for Allied forces to move rapidly toward strategic targets. Towns that had been part of the German defensive belt were liberated in quick succession. Railways and supply depots fell into Allied hands intact. This sudden loss of territory left German commanders scrambling to form new lines farther to the rear, but they lacked the men and material to do so effectively. As the Allies advanced, they kept the pressure constant. Artillery moved forward to stay within range. Supply convoys worked through the night to bring fuel and ammunition. Air forces attacked retreating German columns and disrupted movement behind the lines. The combination of ground, air, and logistical support proved unstoppable. Each element reinforced the other, leaving the Germans with no time to recover. At the operational level, this battle marked a turning point. It was no longer just a question of tactics or terrain. The overwhelming firepower displayed during the attack revealed the full weight of Allied industrial strength. The German army, once feared for its skill and mobility, was now being crushed by numbers it could not match. Even well-trained units with experienced officers could not stand against such sustained force. The implications went beyond the battlefield. German factories were already struggling to meet the demands of the war. Allied bombing campaigns had damaged production centers and disrupted transport networks. Fuel shortages worsened by the day. Every shell fired by the Allies highlighted a grim truth for the Germans. They were fighting an opponent who could produce weapons and ammunition on a scale far beyond their own capabilities. Reports from the front reached the German high command quickly. At first, they were fragmentary, mentions of local setbacks and gaps in the line. As the day progressed, the scope of the disaster became clear. Divisions that had reported full-strength days earlier now sent messages saying they were destroyed or scattered. Requests for reinforcements piled up, but there were no reserves to send. The commanders at the top realized they were facing a crisis they could not contain. In Berlin, discussions turned grim. Senior officers studied maps and production figures, comparing them to the reports coming from the front. The numbers were stark. The Allies were firing more shells in a single day than German factories could produce in an entire month. It was not just artillery. Allied tank production dwarfed German output. Air superiority allowed the Allies to strike at will. The imbalance had become total. This realization forced the German leadership to confront the reality of their situation. They could no longer fight a modern industrial war on equal terms. Their strategies, once built around speed and surprise, were now obsolete. Defensive operations consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. Every battle drained their strength without hope of replenishment. Faced with this, desperation set in. Some officers argued for a strategic withdrawal to shorten the front and conserve forces. Others, including Hitler, rejected the idea. Retreat was seen as defeat. Instead, they planned bold counterattacks, hoping to strike a decisive blow that would shatter Allied morale and buy time. These plans were risky and often unrealistic. The most notable of these efforts would come later in the year in the Ardennes. The idea was to gather remaining reserves and launch a surprise offensive through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. By breaking through the Allied lines and seizing key cities, the Germans hoped to divide the enemy and force negotiations. But this plan was born from weakness, not strength. It relied on fuel and manpower that barely existed and ignored the overwhelming Allied ability to recover from setbacks. The battle in Normandy exposed the limits of German power. It showed that no matter how skilled their soldiers were, they could not fight indefinitely against an enemy with greater resources and coordination. Each German defeat was now more than a loss of ground. It was a loss of the means to continue the war. Tanks destroyed in battle could not be replaced quickly. Guns lost to bombardment left holes in the defense that could not be filled. For the Allies, the success reinforced their belief in combined arms warfare. Artillery, infantry, tanks, and aircraft worked together in a seamless operation. The logistics network that fed this system was as important as the fighting itself. Commanders saw that careful planning and supply could achieve what sheer bravery and effort could not. This lesson would guide future operations as the war moved toward Germany's borders. In the days after the breakthrough, German prisoners spoke openly about their shock. They described entire positions wiped out before they had a chance to fight. Some spoke of orders to stand fast that no longer made sense when everything around them had been destroyed. Allied interrogators noted a change in tone. These were not the confident, disciplined soldiers of earlier campaigns. They were men who understood that their side was no longer capable of winning. As the front stabilized temporarily farther east, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. For the Allies, it was proof that the end of the war was coming into view. For the Germans, it was a sign that every future battle would be fought under the shadow of overwhelming Allied strength. Each day would bring more shells, more tanks, more planes, things they could no longer hope to match. When the guns went silent and the front moved east, the impact of that single day of fire did not fade. The scale of the bombardment became a point of study for military planners and historians alike. It was more than a battle won through tactics. It was proof that modern warfare had shifted from the skill of individual soldiers to the power of factories, shipping networks, and logistics. The Allies had shown that a war could be decided not only on the battlefield, but in assembly lines thousands of miles away. The sheer volume of shells fired in a single day became a benchmark for what an industrial war machine could achieve. Allied nations had built a system that stretched across oceans. Workers in American and British factories built guns, tanks, and ammunition around the clock. Liberty ships carried those supplies across the Atlantic. Once they reached Europe, truck convoys and rail lines moved them to the front without pause. Each step depended on the one before it. If any link had broken, the guns would have gone quiet. Instead, the system worked smoothly and allowed the Allies to unleash firepower on a scale never seen before. This had long-term effects on how militaries thought about war. After 1945, planners began to see logistics as the foundation of all operations. It was not enough to have skilled troops or advanced weapons. Armies needed secure supply lines and a reliable flow of equipment. During the early years of the Cold War, both NATO and the Soviet Union built their doctrines around this idea. They studied the battles of World War II, especially those in Western Europe, to understand how to fight in an industrial age. The lessons learned went beyond logistics. Artillery itself was transformed by the experience. Before Normandy, many armies saw artillery as a support weapon, something to soften enemy positions before infantry attacked. The Allied barrage in 1944 proved that artillery could be a decisive tool in its own right. It could destroy defenses, disrupt command structures, and break enemy morale before the first tank or soldier moved forward. After the war, NATO armies invested heavily in artillery systems. They developed new techniques for coordinating fire missions, integrating radar and aerial reconnaissance into every stage of planning. Training also changed. Soldiers learned not only how to fight but how to keep the machinery of war supplied. Entire units were dedicated to transport, repair, and logistics. The Red Ball Express became a model for how to move massive amounts of material under combat conditions. Future military operations, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond, relied on these ideas. The experience of Normandy became a guidebook for modern warfare. For Germany, the memory of that day was bitter and lasting. Surviving soldiers wrote about it in their memoirs, describing the moment when they realized the war was lost. Many compared the barrage to natural disasters like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. There was no way to fight back against such force. These accounts captured not only the physical destruction but also the psychological impact. German soldiers who had fought on many fronts spoke of their shock at seeing entire units wiped out before they could even fire a shot. These stories found their way into history books and documentaries after the war. They gave later generations a glimpse into what it felt like to stand on the receiving end of industrial warfare. For Allied veterans, the memories were different but equally powerful. Many recalled their awe as they watched the barrage unfold. Some spoke of feeling safe behind such overwhelming firepower. Others described the strange silence that followed when the guns finally stopped. The cultural memory of the event grew over time. In the countries that had supplied the Allied armies, it became a symbol of national effort. Civilians who had worked in factories and shipyards understood that their labor had helped create that moment. The battle showed how every part of society was connected in total war. It was not just soldiers on the front line who determined victory, but also the workers who built the weapons and the planners who kept the supply lines open. Museums and memorials in Normandy still preserve artifacts from that day. Rusted shell casings, damaged guns, and photographs remind visitors of the scale of the fighting. Historians continue to analyze the operation, comparing production figures and battlefield reports to understand how such an overwhelming force was assembled and directed. Each new study adds depth to the understanding of how modern war functions. The day also influenced how nations prepared for future conflicts. During the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact structured their forces with the lessons of Normandy in mind. They built vast stockpiles of ammunition and fuel. They trained logistics units to keep supply moving even under attack. They developed new artillery systems with greater range and accuracy, believing that massed firepower could still decide battles in the nuclear age. For the soldiers who lived through it, the memories were deeply personal. Some carried the sounds of the barrage with them for the rest of their lives. Others struggled with the images of destroyed villages and wounded civilians. Letters and diaries from the time reveal how individuals processed the experience. Allied soldiers wrote home describing the power of their guns but also the devastation they saw. German soldiers described their fear and confusion, trying to make sense of a battle they never truly fought, only endured. In the decades that followed, these accounts shaped public understanding of the war. Documentaries and films drew on their words, bringing the past to life for new generations. The contrast between the advancing Allies and the retreating Germans became a central narrative of the final year of the war in Europe. It was a story of production meeting destruction, of strategy shaped by industry. Even today, the image of thousands of guns firing in unison remains striking. It represents a moment when the full power of modern industry was turned toward a single purpose. The battlefield in Normandy became a demonstration of what nations could achieve when they mobilized completely for war. It was both a military victory and a symbol of the age of total war, an age that would define the rest of the 20th century.